Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. My last video, I compared the R5 Mk II and the Canon R1 ISO performance. In this video, I'm going to compare the autofocus performance, centered on photographing birds. What else? So, if you're interested in knowing what I found out, and I think you might be surprised by what I found, at least a little bit, stay tuned. All right, here we are, out of the field. Been spending a lot of time shooting this camera, R1, right? And then the R5 Mk II. Hundreds of thousands of images on these cameras now, so I feel pretty confident. If I'm not confident by now, I don't know. But in the autofocus and how the autofocus behaves in these two cameras, the purpose of this video is not to directly compare the performance of the autofocus of these two cameras, the R1 and the R5 Mk II. They're really, really close. It's more to show you, to give you an opportunity to see how the autofocus of these two cameras behaves. And I shoot zone a lot, the flexible zones in these two cameras, with eye detection turned on, with it turned off, bigger zones, smaller zones, depending on the subject size and things like that. I can't show you all the different combinations. It's impossible. So what I did is I set these cameras to zone for the most part. I've got my 3 back buttons set up. Autofocus on, set to zone. Asterisk button set to the direct link to eye detection autofocus, whole area tracking. And then my far right button is always on spot. But what I want to show you the behavior of today, what fun would it be to look at the behavior of spot autofocus? Well, it works. It works really well to snipe at little things in branches like warblers and stuff like that. But I wanted to show you how zone works, what you can see from these video clips that I took of the viewfinder, how the autofocus is behaving in zone. Maybe it'll help you determine whether these cameras in shooting zone specifically is the way you want to go. I do switch back and forth. I use eye detection, whole area tracking from time to time in these video clips that I recorded of the viewfinder behavior of these autofocus systems shooting birds. Birds in a lot of different backgrounds, birds, ripply and glary water, birds flying, birds swimming, birds gaining quickly on the camera, all these different scenarios of zone autofocus with tracking, with eye detection turned on. Again, I can't show you every combination of all these things, but it's principally the tracking type, the zone type autofocus that people are using in these cameras. So that's what I'm showing you today in this video. I had to track birds in flight looking at the back, at the screen of an external recorder. Not the easiest thing to do, so bear with me with some shakiness sometimes, but I hope I did a good enough job to where you can determine some things from what you see. In the end of the video, maybe I'll say, I like this autofocus in this camera better than the other. Nope, I'm not going to say that because they are so close in performance. The R1 may be a little bit better in some cases than the R5 Mk II, but I will talk about a limitation that I found in the R1. For me, the way I have the R1 set up, because they are different autofocus systems. This one has the cross type, the R1. The R5 Mk II does not. So we'll look at some of that. This camera also has a dual position autofocus on button on the back. The R5 Mk II has just the typical single stage. You push the button in and you get what you have set there. For me, it's the zone autofocus in this case. On the R1, I played around with setting up the dual functions on that autofocus on button. Half press being spot instead of the far right button, the autofocus point button, and then the full press being my zone. I did play around with that a lot. You may want to stay tuned for what I found out about that setup. Again, that's the way I had it set up. There's a lot of different ways you can use the dual function of that autofocus on button. I was using it to have two different autofocus areas, half press, full press. Like I said, spot, half press, zone, full press. Some interesting stuff happened when I did that. So, this video is about giving you an opportunity to see the behavior of these autofocus systems in these two cameras in several different shooting scenarios, and that way maybe you'll have more data to make a decision on which camera you want to buy. It's not to say one's better than the other, because we're nitpicking now. They're both really, really good. So here we go. Let's dive on in to looking at the behavior of these autofocus systems. Before we do that, I'm going to show you exactly how I had these cameras set up autofocus-wise, and then we'll dive into the actual video clips of the behavior of these autofocus systems. So before we actually look at the autofocus behavior of the Canon R5 Mark II and the R1, let's go over how I have my camera set up so when you see what's happening, you know exactly what the settings were that made it act like it did. So, autofocus. The main autofocus setups, of course, servo, autofocus operation, autofocus area. Have it set up for different areas for the position of the camera, horizontal, landscape versus vertical or portrait. Zone 1, flexible zone, and zone 3, flexible zones, respectively. Whole area tracking autofocus is turned off. Subject to detect, of course, will be animals. Eye detection is on auto, so it is enabled. For example, when I'm shooting zone, which is mostly what you're going to see, because I shoot a lot of zone. The case I have set for manual, and I have tracking sensitivity set to all the way to the negative side, which is locked on, and XL decel tracking all the way to the positive. Nothing really to discuss here, or here, or here, or there. The next thing you need to see is how I have my buttons set up. I use back button autofocus. I use 3 back buttons. The first, autofocus on, is set to metering and autofocus start. You can go into the info detail and see that I have nothing in here so that activated, so that means it's defaulting to all those settings I just showed you in the main autofocus menu. My asterisk button is set for a direct link to eye detection autofocus, which gives you the animal detection and whole area tracking. And I have my autofocus point button, the far right button, set up to register and recall a shooting function. And if we go into the detail set for this, you can see that I have it set to spot, the locked spot autofocus area, which automatically turns off any type of detection of a subject, whether it be animals, people, vehicles, it's all turned off. It also turns off whole area tracking. This gives me a pure spot that will not turn to tracking once it sees a subject. So it's just like a gun sight or a rifle sight for me. And the only other thing I have going here is, yep, it needs to autofocus though when I press that button and I have that turned on. So there you go. Those are the settings that I have set up in the R5 Mark II. And I have my R1 set up exactly the same way. The autofocus on button, of course, in that camera is dual stage, 2 positions, half press and full press. I have the half press deactivated and only full press being active, and it's set up the exact same way as in the R5 Mark II, and that is for my zone. Now, I will say this. There's going to be a part to this video at the very end where I show you some behavior of the R1's autofocus when I have dual stage autofocus on button enacted or in place or whatever you want. It's working. Half press is one thing and full press is another. Half press being spot and full press being zone. And we'll see if that had any impact on the behavior of the autofocus system. But that's coming later. So okay, let's move on now, and we're going to go through some scenarios, shooting scenarios, and we'll see some behaviors of the autofocus system for these 2 cameras. Okay, so we're going to first take a look at vertical element behavior. This is the R5 Mark II, and you can see I'm in zone, and it's picking up leaves, and not just the vertical stems. This is different performance than what you saw in the R5, for sure. Now let's, goes right to the bird's eye, ignoring those stems that are actually closer to the camera than the bird. We move over to the right, using zone again. It's wanting the vertical stems, but it's also flickering a bit on the leaves. Still think this is better than the old R5's performance. Still likes the vertical elements when there's no bird in there. Again, we have animal detection on. Let's defocus and come back and see if it'll just grab the bird, ignoring everything else. Went to the, I used spot that time for some reason. Struggling here with the zone, finally finding the eye, but wanting to do plants, parts of the plant and the stems. Let's try defocusing again, bring it back over, again using zone, and that time it went to the bird and then to the eye. Better. So I'm not sure, I think it's better than the old R5, but it's still not going directly to the bird. In the bird's eye, because I do have eye detection enabled. That time we went body and then eye almost instantly, so that's better. Defocus. Try it again. And this time let's try whole frame. And that time the direct link to eye detection using the whole frame worked pretty well and went right to the eye. Now we're going to go ahead and try zone, and that time it went right to that. So it's definitely not just going to these vertical elements. So it's a little bit better than what the R5 was. Now let's compare it to the R1, because that is what the new autofocus system, the cross type, is supposed to eliminate. Right, the R1 defocused in zone, and well, let's Grabbing some stems there. Move over a little bit, try this, and a little bit of the leaf up there. Very similar to what we just saw with the R5 Mark II. It's kind of actually going out of focus. So again, it's looking for a bird. It's not seeing anything. And it's flashing around on stems and leaves just like the R5 Mark II did. Oh, ooh, look at that. It goes right to the eye, though, when we move over to the bird, which the R5 Mark II didn't quite handle as well. Right to the eye. Let's defocus and give it another shot. Right to the eye. I think this is better identification of the bird that's defocused than the R5 Mark II. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Let's try whole area. And oop, it went to the body and then to the eye when we went to directly to eye detection with the whole area tracking. Defocus, come back over, try zone one more time. And what do we get here? Try zone, oh, whole area. Eye detection went right to the eye. And the pre-focus with the zone now that the bird's in focus is staying right on the eye. So we'll try one more time. And again, it does a pretty good job of finding that eye. So I think the R1 has about the same affinity to the stems when there's not a bird in the picture or in the frame, when there's not a bird in the frame, but it definitely goes quicker to the eye than the R5 Mark II did. So there you go. Take that for what it is and run with it. All right, now we're going to try quick acquisition of a subject where you get on the subject, I'm hitting zone, and we'll see how well the autofocus grabs onto it and tracks it. I've slowed this down, but we get on the tricolored heron flying, and the R5 Mark II grabs right onto it and is tracking it against what I would consider some pretty tough backgrounds, transitioning backgrounds and things like that. So I'm definitely not disappointed in the acquisition of a subject quickly by the R5 Mark II. Let's see how the R1 does in a similar situation. Quick acquisition of the subject for the R1. Here a gull, again slowed down, got on it, went right on the head, coming down, staying right on that bird all the way to the end, so you can't really complain about that. So the two camera comparison, the R5 Mark II is quick, the R1's quick. My overall impression shooting these two cameras, I can't tell the difference in subject acquisition speed. I'd say they're equal. Next up, general bird and flight tracking behavior for the R5 Mark II to start with. Okay, using zone with the eye detection enabled, we've got a gull flying against a lot of different backgrounds, and the R5 Mark II is doing a great job. It's finding the eye and head when it's there. When it can see it, goes to the body when it can't. Can't ask for much more than that. The R1 now. Gull flying around again, and you wouldn't expect the R1 to have much difficulty here, and it doesn't. Behaves pretty much just like the R5 Mark II. So again, pretty equal performance, I would say. So how good is the R5 Mark II IDing birds among branches? This is a pretty tough one. A dove, a mourning dove in a tree, not big in the frame at all, and it finds it instantly and hangs on to it. It's a little rough there as far as stability, and that makes it harder on the autofocus system, and it still found it. Let's see what the R1 can do. All right, here we are, R1, grackles this time. No problem with the black one. No problem with the brown one. Another black one there. I think the R1 and the R5 Mark II are pretty similar again. All right, let's try some subjects that blend in, some things that are tough to detect. The R5 Mark II, a pair of mottle ducks up against the bank vegetation. It's trying with zone, but it's struggling. Cannot identify a particular bird. There it went to the leaf or something. It's not doing well here. This would be where you'd want to use spot. There it found the head of the male. But anyway, not doing well in that situation. Let's try the R1. The R1, again, a mottled duck pair, starting out as a single bird, but turning into a pair, and better light. Overall, similar situation, finding the head of that bird, but it's lit up better here. But then when they get together, it was a difficult scenario again. But overall, I will say that the R1 does a little bit better in that situation than the R5 Mark II does. How about poor light focusing by the R5 Mark II? It's raining, it's misty, and it's low light. ISO 20,000 here on a bird moving really fast. And I think the R5 Mark II does really well in this scenario, and it is consistently good in this scenario. Poor light on the R1. The Kingfisher again, the light doesn't look as bad here, but it's ISO 40,000 at 1/160th of a second. And this camera, I think, did an admirable job, an awesome job. Very difficult to track situation. You want to take another look at an R1 in that situation? This time ISO 16,000. And following that bird's head pretty much right up to the perch, and then instantly onto the eye. This is, I couldn't ask for any better. The R5 Mark II and the R1 autofocus systems are amazingly good, even in poor light with really fast subjects. Rippled water and water with a lot of glare can drive autofocus systems nuts. R5 Mark II in that scenario, mottled duck swimming, it finds the birds, very little problem. Same situation for the R1. No problem finding these birds as they swim on this very rippled and glared up water. These autofocus systems now that identify birds and their heads and stuff seem to be doing much, much better these days on these types of shooting scenarios. Now, very close eye tracking on the R5 Mark II. This is a little blue heron, and that eye's pretty obvious, and camera's having no issues staying with that. Birds in flight really close, sticking on that eye. So there you go. R1, same scenario. This time, a little gosling walking in the grass, very close. R1, no problem here. Birds in flight. Ibis, white ibis coming in really fast. No problem there either. These autofocus systems are amazing. All right, a little bit of a warning about using the dual autofocus on button the way I have been trying to use it, and that's with spot on the half press and zone on the full press. It seems to make the zone autofocus not as good. And you can see from this example the trouble the autofocus is having grabbing onto this gull with this setup. You saw before that it did not have trouble like this when it was set to just single action, and that was full press for zone. Again, like I stated in the beginning of the video, this is just a few examples. I'm telling you this because it has been a consistent issue that I have found. So now I use dual autofocus on button as just a single action button with full press being zone, and that really seemed to solve my problem that I was having. Not sure if any of you have seen that, but that's what I was experiencing, so just wanted to relay that here. Okay, so there you have it. You saw the behavior of the autofocus systems of these two cameras. I'll talk about that whole autofocus on dual stage thing for the R1 in a minute. Do I have a favorite? Well, first of all, let me just say this. They're both really good. Some people think, well, the R5 Mark II may not be as fast as quick acquisition and staying on subjects, gaining quickly on the camera and stuff like that. I think those days are over. You always liked the 1 series for that because you had higher voltage with the bigger battery, the built-in grip with the bigger battery. On this lens and on my 600 f4, I am not seeing that. Really, of all the lenses I've used on these 2 cameras, I am not seeing the R1 being that much quicker and snappier than the R5 Mark II. Now, I shoot a battery grip. I can't tell you what it's like without the battery grip. I just don't shoot it without the battery grip. So I have 2 batteries in there. Whether that adds more voltage and stuff, I have no idea. Can't find information on that. But I can tell you this, and you can see it from these video clips, which were good depictions of the overall performance that I have found over hundreds of thousands of pictures being taken for the behavior of the autofocus, these autofocus systems in those scenarios. And I don't see a huge advantage of the R1 over the R5 Mark II in quickness, snappiness. Now, it did a little bit better maybe with the vertical stuff. That very first thing you saw, it seemed like the detection of the bird when you was quicker and better. Those vertical things in the way and stuff, those stems, than the R5 Mark II. But I'll tell you, I've seen an improvement in the R5 Mark II over, like I said, over the R5, the old R5 for sure. So this isn't bad in that scenario anymore. Maybe this is a little bit better. But this thing with the dual button, the dual autofocus on button, there's something weird going on there when I have it set to half press being spot and full press being zone, and I'm pressing it to all the way down to zone, and the zone doesn't seem to be as good. It doesn't find the bird as well. Stay on the bird as well. I'm not sure what's going on there. Let me know what you found in that case if you set it up like I have it set up. If you set it up some other way, let's say with half press being something that isn't autofocus related, but then full press is, or the other way around, maybe you can tell me that it works fine then, you know, and stuff. So I don't know, there's so many different ways to set it up. Again, I'm not going to, this video would be 5 hours long if we went through all the different combinations and things like that. I'm just letting you know what I found with that combination. So what am I doing? I'm basically shooting the R1 and the R5 Mark II set up exactly the same. How I've set up the R5 and the R3 and everything that I've had. Autofocus on button now is on the R1 and the R5 Mark II. It's just single stage going to zone when it's full press. The asterisk button being my direct link to eye detection autofocus, whole frame tracking, whole area tracking, and then the asterisk, and then the autofocus point button, the very far right-hand button, being set to the locked spot, where it just gives me pure spot autofocus, no tracking, none of that stuff. That's the way I have both these cameras set up now, and being set up basically the same, they're behaving almost exactly the same. So that's my conclusion. I love them both. Now the R1's got some benefits when it comes to, you know, low light shooting over the R5 Mark II and stuff because it's 24 meg, all that kind of stuff. But we're talking about autofocus here, and I love them both set up the way I have them set up now. So there you go. I hope this, seeing how these autofocuses behave, might be helpful to you for some reason. And if it was, and you really like my channel, please subscribe. I always like to get new subscribers. YouTube likes it when I get new subscribers. At least I think they do. I don't know. Please subscribe. Want to see more of my videos. I've been doing a lot of Canon-centric videos because these 2 new cameras came out. And when the new 200 to 500 lens comes out, the f4 zoom, if it ever does, I'll be doing some stuff on that. But I'm going to try to do some videos coming up that are not just looking at the performance of these cameras and things like that. Just some showing off some of my pictures and video footage and things, because I haven't done much of that lately, and I want to. If I have time, I'm going to do that. Lots of stuff going on with tours and all that. So anyway, hey, until next time, I hope you're having great light out there. I hope you're getting great images. And video cameras too. Yeah. Until next time, stay safe. I'll see you soon.